because we've got a great speaker lined up. So Adam Skinner is somebody I met when, you probably don't remember this, but we were on our training course, and I was on a week-long training course in between jobs, and we were doing a expert level qualification for IPMO.
IPMO, yes, of course, I'm sorry, yes.
PMO learning. And so I was there working really hard, making lots of notes, and Adam was in and out because he was on consulting duties. And I was like, how does he do it? He seems to know everything that's going on. So I was very impressed with him. And then we stayed in touch, and when I called out to him if he could do a talk for the BCS Proms G, he said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So I really appreciate Adam's time and effort in preparing the talk and coming here. He's a director of P2 Consulting, and I think you've got 15 plus years of transformational experience. As well as that, you've got a master's from Oxford University in program management. And I had no idea Oxford University did program management, but if you're going to do a master's in program management, that is the place to get it from, I would suggest. You are
particularly if you like dinners, they do some very good dinners there.
Oh, excellent dinners. Probably no match for our sandwich buffet, I guess. But so you also are a blogger on various sites. You've co-authored some books, and you are co-chair of the APM's
Portfolio Management SIG.
Portfolio Management SIG. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Adam Skinner.
Thank you very much. Oh, I shall blush. Thanks. That's really kind of. I'm so sorry. You're absolutely right. We did. I was running in and out the whole week though, but it was a good course, wasn't it? It was quite fun.
It was.
So listen, thanks so much for inviting me to come and talk to you. I'm here for a very particular reason. I co-chair what's called the Portfolio Management Specific Interest Group for the APM, which is very similar to the groups that we're sitting in today, but our focus is very much on something called portfolio management. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, mainly because we've just brought out a book called The Practitioner's Guide for Portfolio Management. So what we're going to do today, if that's okay, is I'll talk a bit about portfolio management. I'll talk about what I think is the whys, the whats, and the hows of that. So we'll explore why it's quite an important thing. We'll explore what it tries to do, and then we'll try and dig into a bit of, let's say the how, because there are a myriad of different ways you can do this strange thing called portfolio management. And kind of once we've got that foundation, I'll do a little bit of digging into what we try and do with the guide, and why we wrote it, and what it covers. And then I'll do a little bit at the end where I'm going to try and co-opt you and tell you how great the APM is and convince you want to join the SIG. So we'll keep that bit nice and short. And I'm being joined here by my colleague Ocean, who's on the SIG as well. So he's going to pop up and show you equally how wonderful it is to be part of us. So if that's okay, we'll kick off. And we've got a bit of time. Feel free to shout out any questions you've got. And if I can't answer them, we'll park them and we'll try and come back to them at the end. Is that okay? Great stuff. Right, so, yes, very important question. Agile. It's a really interesting topic. It's a particularly interesting topic when you get to the portfolio space, but it is quite an involved topic. So I thought I'd pause at the beginning, because I know BCS is very into kind of adaptive ways of delivery. And see, do people want to talk a little bit about Agile at the portfolio management level? Because we'll dig into that. That takes a little bit of time. Or would people just like to focus on kind of old school waterfall portfolio management? Can I say a bit of a show of hands for a bit of an Agile deep dive? All right, we'll try and do that. I will press you that by saying there really are no perfect answers around Agile and portfolio management. I'll explain why that is later, but I can certainly talk you through the sort of different methodologies that are out there and that might help you try and do that. Cool, all right, let's crack on. I won't bore you with that. That's basically me looking a lot younger. But as I say, I'm kind of here because I co-chair the APM's Portfolio Management SIG, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Great stuff. Okay, so what are we going to do now? I'm going to talk a bit about the why, the what, and the how of portfolio management. So, if you kind of go back in time, kind of 70 years, when project management first started to become a discipline, and as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, it kind of grew a lot out of what happened in World War II, the development of Apollo, the development of nuclear weapons and the like. And it was taking the disciplines of engineering and really trying to put a bit of structure on how you go on the journey. And then if you kind of fast forward about 20, 30 years, you get to the IT explosion. And actually it seems like a very good way of harnessing a way of progressing development by using project management to control that journey. And if you kind of move that slightly forward, people started talking about the concept of value. So it's all great to kind of create these really cool gizmos, but are they really doing what the business needs? And then you go from a world of project management to a world of program management, where you're starting to say, well, what's the real value of doing this stuff? And that's kind of where you start to get into my world of portfolio management, because you start to get a really interesting question around project money and the money you spend on project money. So let's do a little bit of a show of hands. So imagine your organisation spends £100 on project management. How much of that £100 of money spent actually delivers the value of the projects you're trying to deliver? Do you think all 100% goes to it? Is it kind of 80%? Is it 60%? Is it 50%? Who thinks 50% in their organisations? Let's take it up a bit. Who about 60%? Ooh, wow, we're doing well. 80%? Go down. Oh gosh, okay, 35%. Wow, that's lower than most. That's lower than most people I talked to about this. But let's assume for a second. Sorry. Hey, whoa, why not? That's a really good place. But let's assume that of £100 you spend, £75 of that, so 75%, actually delivers the output you're expecting. That's kind of okay, and people think that's kind of reasonable or not. But then there's another metric you start to think. So, okay, how much of that money you spend on projects actually delivers projects that support the organisation, so actually deliver value to the organisation? If you start thinking about that metric, and you start thinking about 75% or so, you start to get to a problem. Because actually project management and program management start to work around this concept of doing the thing right. Of £100 spent on a particular project to deliver 100 A's, we have delivered 75 A's. Well, that's 75% of the value. But of those A's, we only needed 75 of them. So you've got this other problem, which is doing the right thing. Should we have built 100 A's? Were 50 A's okay? And this is the world I kind of live in. This is the world of portfolio management. Because if you start to sit there and say, well, only 75% of our money was spent delivering and doing the thing right, and only 75% was spent doing the right thing, you find you've only actually delivered 50% of value from your £100. And that's a waste of 50%. Now, the world of program and project management is all about making sure we are doing the thing right. I've been asked to deliver 100 A's. I have delivered 100 A's. The world of portfolio management is all about saying, what is the organisational strategy? The organisational strategy is to build a load of A's. So we're going to build 100 A's. We're going to build 75 A's, or so on, so forth. So when we're talking to organisations about 3PM, project, program, and portfolio management, we're saying what you're essentially trying to do is, number one, make sure you can deliver what you set out to deliver. But number two, and don't ignore this, is the thing you're trying to deliver aligned to your organisational strategy? Because if it's not, that is wasted money. That is wasted value. So when you start to get to kind of the late 90s, people started to talk a lot about this. And it really came out of two worlds. The one world was the financial world, where they were very comfortable with this concept of portfolio, this idea of we're going to spend a certain amount of money on shares and assets, and we need to get a certain amount of value. People started to apply that kind of language. The other place it came out of was the asset management world, so the utilities world. We have a large body of assets, factories, and the like. What is the best way to maximise that to deliver the strategy? So this concept of what are the right things to do for the strategy of the organisation starts to come together from these two worlds. So people start to talk about portfolio management as opposed to project and program management. So that's really what the why of portfolio management is supposed to do. It's about trying to make sure that your change budget is aligned to the strategy of your organisation. Simple when you put it like that, incredibly complicated, of course, in practice. So what is it really? I'm going to throw some definitions up here. I'm sorry to do this, lots of words here, but there's some quite useful things if you start to unpick them. Because if you look at the classic definition of program management, I'm using MSP as that definition, if that's okay. Program management is the action of coordinating, organising, directing, and implementing the temporary, flexible organisation, i.e. the project or the program, that consists of a dossier of projects and transformation activities to achieve outcomes and realise benefits. It's very much about, we've been told to deliver a load of benefits, we're going to organise the machine that's going to get us to those benefits. Portfolio management, and I'm going to pause here slightly because there are a lot of different definitions, but obviously I'm going to push our one. Portfolio management, though, talks about something slightly different. It talks about selection, prioritisation and control of an organisation's projects and programmes in line with those strategic objectives and the capacity to deliver. The goal is to balance change initiatives and business as usual while optimising return on investment. This is a continuous process to achieve the evolving strategy of the organisation. So let me pick a few things out of there which I think are really important and help us understand what's going on. So if we look at the similarities first of all, there's an awful lot of stuff about coordination and control, and I think that's very similar in both the programme and the portfolio world. We talk about projects and transformation, so obviously it's got something to do with change, trying to change the organisation. And we talk about strategy. So there's a really important line, strategic objectives, that sits both in the portfolio and the programme world. But let's talk about what's different now, because actually often that's where most of the useful information comes out. So there's something really important in the portfolio world around selection and prioritisation, because a really important concept around portfolio management is that you have limited resources. So the fundamental activity of portfolio management is trying to understand how one applies those resources to deliver the most value. Now, obviously, you're doing an element of that project of program management. You always do, but it is the modus operandi. It's the raison d'etre of portfolio management, the actual activity of selection and prioritization. We talk about, killed it. No, we're okay. We talk about balancing the change initiatives and business as usual. So the other really important thing about portfolio management is it so often is the connection between the business as usual, the operation of the business, and our change world. And we often talk about these as two different worlds, and portfolio management sits between the two. It's an incredibly important activity in the portfolio space, trying to balance what's going on in the operational world with what's going on in the change world and trying to make sure the resource is in the right place. And the final bit, which I'm going to draw out here, is this word temporary and this word continuous. Because one of the really interesting things, when you look at the different definitions of change, of project, of program, or even when you're talking to the agile world, there's a lot of variation in the language used, but the word that always comes out is the word temporary. So when you're talking about project or program, almost one of the fundamental concepts is it is a temporary organisation. I have stood it up for a period of time to do something very specific. If you look at portfolio management, if you look at the portfolio office, the portfolio structure, this sits in the permanent organisation. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but actually, if you start to think about how we relate to change, and the change relates to time, you think about your projects and programs, they have a very linear activity. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there is theoretically an end. You are going somewhere. But the portfolio office is not going anywhere. It works on a cyclical basis, almost always tied into the financial cycle of the organisation. So I, as portfolio manager, need to talk to the wider operational business, the wider financial business, about what I need in terms of resources to tie into their cycle, which is almost always the financial cycle. We'll come back to this, but that drives for me what I think are the two fundamental problems of portfolio management, one of which is psychological and one of which is organisational. The psychological one is that when you're doing a change program, it's actually incredibly easy to draw people's attention in. There's always a goal to hit. There's almost always a crisis you're driving towards, and people like it, and they run into rooms and they'll talk about it, and they'll do governance decisions and the like. Because portfolio management is always going on, it actually is quite hard after you've already set something up to maintain the interest and the focus of the senior stakeholders who have to be tied into it. So when I say psychological, probably the first problem around portfolio management is maintaining the interest and the energy that is almost a byproduct of doing program and project management. And the other fundamental problem is an organisational one, in that when I'm delivering my projects and program, I want to be talking about kind of everything in a linear sense, i.e., I know I'm going there, this is the chunk of money I think I need at the moment to get there. Great. Whereas when I'm talking in the portfolio world, my CFO just wants to know how much you need to spend in this 1 year period or this 2 year period or this quarter. So I am having to carve up my change activities into nice, easy little chunks that tie into the financial cycle. And I'm almost always finding that's constricting my ability to deliver change because I'm being forced to work within that chunk of activity. So when I talk about portfolio management, I talk about two really challenging problems. As I say, one is that psychological one, and one is that organizational one. All driven from the fact that program management is temporary. Portfolio management is this continuous, permanent activity. So, differences around selection and prioritization, balance and optimization, and this concept of permanent versus temporary. So we're talking about that concept of what is portfolio management. I'll boil it down into two really fundamental things. When I'm doing portfolio management, I am either working to prioritize the resources I've got to tie it into the strategy of the organization. And what I'm essentially trying to do is balance the cost, the risk, and the achievability against the strategic goals and the value of the different bits of activity. And we call that optimization. And there's a really important role of the program management office as opposed to portfolio management office. The program management office is still worrying about cost and risk and achievability, but it has almost always been told what the outcomes it needs to achieve are. So you've got this challenge at the portfolio level, you're trying to balance risk against value. At the program level, you've been told the value you need to deliver. You're trying to deliver it within the cost, risk, and achievability envelope. And if you went back sort of 10 years, that would be all the portfolio management office would be expected to do, to balance that out and to say what the portfolio should look like. More recently, though, portfolio management has started to focus a bit more on portfolio delivery assurance. So if you think the one side is about saying what the right structure for the portfolio is, the more modern definition is what is the activity that we should be doing around this portfolio to reduce the delivery risk. And that's not project or program management, that's activities that can only really be done at the portfolio level to help get that portfolio over the line. Classic example is dependency management. And yes, you can, of course, manage dependencies between projects and programs, but it's considerably easier if you have someone sitting above that, looking across those range of projects, working out where the interactions are and managing that almost as a referee around those dependencies. Other classic stuff you see is management of the change capability. So again, if you've got a kind of big portfolio of a lot of different projects and programs, it's very hard for the program manager to work out what resource he can pull from the pool. He doesn't know who else is pulling from it. The portfolio can look down into that and say, I've got a resource pool of 100 people. I know I need 150 people. I'm going to go and get 50 people from the contractor market, and I'm going to balance people out there. The project program management can't really do that. Obviously, you've got roadmaps, and some other really powerful stuff is around change maturity. So is the business ready to receive all this change that's coming towards it from the portfolio? Again, it's very hard to tailor that from the project or program's point of view. It's much easier, well, it can be done much more effectively, looking down from on top. So if you look at a modern definition of the portfolio office, it tends to be taking on a load of roles that are around reducing the risk of delivery through functions and actions that only it can do. So two kind of worlds that people ask me, what does the portfolio office do? It's about that balancing and optimization. It's about delivering the risk of the portfolio. So we've talked about the why. We've talked a bit about the what is it. Let me talk to you a bit about the how. And how is where it gets a little bit more complicated because there isn't really a particular way of, there isn't really a kind of winning way of doing it. There are just a lot of different tools and techniques that one can apply. When I posted this on LinkedIn the other day that I was coming to talk to, someone put a really interesting comment that said something along the lines, it'll be interesting to see how your approach wins in a competition against Axelos's approach. And actually that's entirely the wrong way for me of looking at portfolio management, because portfolio management is really about a whole range of different tools you can pull out of the box, and some are right to apply in certain situations and some are not right to apply in certain situations. So it's certainly not a competition. This model here you may be familiar with. So this is what Steve Jadder came up with, probably the first really official kind of portfolio approach. And he did this for OGC. a good 15 years ago now. This is the original management of portfolio model. And if you look at it, what it's essentially trying to do is something actually quite interesting and unique in the world of change, because it's starting to say there's no real end to this. There's a kind of continual loop, portfolio definition and portfolio delivery. And to deliver that, there's a load of stuff you need. And the absolute number one thing is absolutely senior management commitment, utter buy-in from the C-suite. That was quite an interesting concept, but entirely right, because actually if you look at any single portfolio methodology, they all start with the fact that if you don't have C-suite behind you, you aren't getting anywhere, you aren't making the decisions you need to make to be able to prioritise and move forward. And he talks about governance alignment, strategy, having an office, and so on and so forth. So there's a range of stuff he talks about. So the really interesting first part he starts on was saying, look, it's this continual loop, it's not linear, you're doing definition and you're doing delivery kind of at the same time. So that's management of portfolios. Big fan of that. Actually, that's kind of where I started my portfolio journey. I'm digging into this. This isn't actually APM. This is kind of one of my company's things. But this is what we use when we talk about what the portfolio needs to do. And again, I talk about here that pretty important thing about optimization and that really important thing about delivery, so reducing the risks while providing leadership. I want to stick this up here, though, because it allows me to do a bit of a deep dive to show you, well, what can that mean in practice in the portfolio office? And on the optimization side, there's a load of stuff. There's understanding the strategy, there's tracking benefits, there's doing stage gate reviews to check the journey, risk and issue management to understand the risk you're working to, and of course, the optimization at the bottom. And on the delivery side, actually, it's managing standards, it's kind of owning the roadmaps, dependency management we talked about, business implementation, demand management, what resource could you need, reporting and governance. I'm not saying everyone has to do all that stuff. I'm trying to give you a sense of there is a huge smorgasbord of stuff you can do at the portfolio level to be able to say you are both optimizing and delivering. This is the APM approach. And again, we'll dig into this a little bit later on. But where this varies from management of portfolio is we're really, really big on understanding the vision and the corporate strategy. So for us, the really important thing about portfolio management is it's taking a lot of time to really get where the organization is going and trying to define what value means to the organization. Because once you've done that, once you know what value means here, then you can take your various different business cases, your various different projects and programs, and properly optimize them. If you don't know what value means here, you can't even begin to do portfolio management because you can't really start to do that balancing out of benefits against cost. It's really nice if you can get down to a number. So actually, we know this piece of work here is going to reduce the bottom line or find a new purchase stream or find a new stream of value. But 9 times out of 10, you find it's really hard to do that or actually be really clear about that. So you often have to find other metrics that allow you to have a sensible conversation about value. So for us, value is absolutely preeminent. The other thing that we push very hardly is actually it's not just about the change world, it's also as the business as usual world. So as you start to try and build the portfolio, it's really important to try and understand what activity is going on in the business as usual, where change can be sucked in, and so on and so forth. Dig into this a bit later on. But I wanted to stick this up here now because it's definitely one of the hows of portfolio management with a couple of interesting additions that we push incredibly hard. So, I promised we were going to talk about agile. So let us talk about agile. I'm actually a really big fan of agile. I'm a safe practitioner myself, and through my company we do a lot of agile stuff. It wasn't always that way. My very first agile program was I set up the PMO on something called Universal Credit, which is a very big government program and was also government's first attempt to do agile. And the fact that it got kicked off when David Cameron first became PM and is still going kind of shows you how successful it was as an agile transformation. So my first experience of agile was pretty awful, quite frankly. But I've become actually quite a convert to it. The APM actually doesn't talk a great deal about agile, but it's something we're really trying to encourage and move them towards. And I know you guys have been really kind of pushing it very hard as an industry body, and thank you for that, because it's really helped us and really helped change the nature of how we do change in this country. But agile at portfolio management level is quite a hard conversation. Because at the portfolio management level is essentially about saying, I'm going to sit at the top of the organisation and define what value looks like. And I'm going to say value is this and this and this and this and this, and I want you to go away and deliver it. Of course, Agile tries to flip that on its head and say, actually, the person closest to the ground, the person closest to the customer, is the one who really knows what value is. So how dare you at the top try and define that, because I'm the person at the ground and I can say what good looks like and not. Now, that's a massive oversimplification, but that's kind of the challenge you get to when you talk about portfolio management and Agile. I stick this up here because this is one of the things we do as the portfolio SIG is every 6 months we have what's called a portfolio directors dinner, where we get kind of about 16 quite high-end portfolio directors in a room. We take them out to dinner, we ply them with alcohol, we ask them quite a tough question, and we record it and we write it into something. And we've just done a really interesting one called Why is it so hard to make hard decisions? So there's a really interesting thing about portfolio management where people just can't make decisions. The C-suite doesn't make the decisions. And why is that the case? We had a really interesting conversation about that. But a year ago, we asked this question: the agile portfolio, fact or fiction? And actually the room peeled into two. So half the room, mainly the government people actually, were saying, I don't care if it's agile or if it's waterfall. At the portfolio level, I am just going to define what value looks like, and I'm going to put big chunks of money against that. Then actually, they can go away and deliver it, give me as much value as I expect, and I'm going to check them every 3 months or whatever. If they aren't doing it, there's going to be trouble. So if the one half of the room was saying, I don't really care what the delivery methodology is, portfolio level doesn't make a difference, chunks of money, boom, boom, boom. The other half of the room was saying, well, actually, the fundamental point around Agile is that I can no longer define what value looks like. So my job is not about saying what value is. My job is more to provide funding release mechanisms and help people understand the strategy of the organization so that my various business owners can draw down the money, but I'm helping them understand how they can pour that money and what the governance structure is around that. So it really was an interesting split and an interesting discussion. And it all really came down to this language of value and who has the power to say what value means in the modern business world. Now, the one other thing I was going to throw up when talking about Agile was SAFE. Because SAFE, in my opinion, has probably taken the biggest strides from a kind of pure Agile world to try and tackle the portfolio management question, the question of how you align strategy to change. Are there any SAFE practitioners in here? I'm just interested to see how big the rollout of it is. I'm quite a big fan of SAFE, actually. It's still got an awful lot of gaps in it, but a lot of methodologies do. But I do think it's probably the most complete answer to how one scales Agile. What SAFE says at the portfolio level, they talk about lean portfolio management, and they really talk about kind of there's 3 chunks of things going on. There's strategy and investment funding. So actually what I want to be doing at the top level is not necessarily saying how money needs to be spent, but identifying what the value streams are. So what that basically means is I'm going to say what value means to me. I'm going to say how much money I'm willing to put towards that value. And then I'm going to release that into the system, whereby then the Scrum teams and the release teams and the various people doing the doing can then have the challenge of pulling that money down, and delivering the value. So I'm not going to say how you have to deliver that value. I'm just going to say what the value I want is and how much it costs. I then have this Agile portfolio operation thing down here, and that's essentially less about governance and more about coaching. So we aren't going to tell you how to do change. We are going to coach you to get better and think in more of a lean, agile way. And then you have this lean governance thing in the corner, which is really about trying to make sure everybody's in the room as we agree the budget. So how is the money going to be spent? And we as a community are going to agree that together. Now, having said all this, I've never really seen this operational in its purest sense. So I've never really seen anyone take this and do it wholeheartedly. I've seen people operate value streams, and I've seen people operate what's called portfolio Kanbans, which are really kind of flowing up the Kanban concept to the portfolio level. And that's all kind of nice and quite a nice way of doing it, but I've never seen this in its entirety. But it's definitely worth exploring. If you're in a heavily agile world, actually it's it'd be quite interesting to pull that book out and have a chat with your portfolio office and talk about trying to maybe implement some of this stuff. So there are answers out there, but again, a lot of it is about trying to apply it in your situation. Now, there is one other thing in the world of portfolio management which is probably worth talking about. And I talked a little bit earlier about this dichotomy between project and program management and the BAU world. One of the, in my opinion, probably the most interesting places portfolio management is going at the moment is a conversation that entirely throws out that dichotomy of business as usual and change. It basically says, we are all one business. Let's not think about change and business as usual. Let's think about breaking our organisation down into particular boxes. This is by a chap called Geoffrey Moore, who's the chap who came up with the concept of crossing the chasm. I don't know if you know that one. That's about how you scale new innovative ideas. I'd highly recommend him. He's one of the most readable business writers I've come across, and this is his most recent one. It's called Zone to Win. What it's basically trying to say is, actually, in this world of disruption, you need to be thinking about your entire organisation in 4 chunks. The bit that delivers revenue, the bit that makes the delivery of revenue more efficient, so kind of just small projects that kind of make your operational more effective or actually bring out new product streams. Your incubation zone, which is kind of your new big ideas, which have a kind of tiny little chunk to them. And this thing called the transformation zone, which basically says when you need to do something really fundamental to transform your business, suddenly this becomes the absolutely most important thing in the business. Less about delivering revenue in the year place, far more about changing your business so it can fight off a disruptor or can become its own disruptor in a new environment. Because his point is actually, we talk about transformation all the time, we don't really do it all the time. And in fact, we shouldn't do it because transformation is incredibly painful. When you fundamentally change the organisation, it's a bloody nightmare. And it reduces your profits and everyone gets distracted. You want to be doing that as little as possible. What you really want to be doing is focusing on your revenue driving and how you kind of increase the value of that. And then every kind of once every 10 years, you transform yourself to manage disruption. Now, I put that up there not to kind of give you a lecture in Zone to Win, but more to say there are new and other ways of doing portfolio management that go beyond this kind of world of trying to say, is it business change or is it business as usual? Some of that, I think, is really very interesting. So we've talked a little bit about, as I say, the why. We've talked a little bit about the what is it, that kind of optimization and assurance. And then we talked about the how. We talked about management of portfolio. We talked about APM. We talked a little bit about agile. And I've talked about this, which is kind of a method that moves away from the bisection. But let me share with you what I think the absolute golden rule of portfolio management is. So I'm not going to dive into this in too much detail, but one of the talks I do is really about kind of the mindset and psychology of change. And I think this is a really interesting area to work in, because actually if you think about small-scale change, actually the way to do it is, you might think it's quite mechanistic and reductionist. Okay, I need to build box A. There's 5 steps I need to do. I'm going to do them. I can do them time and time again. Nice and easy, boom, boom, boom. The more you scale a change challenge, so the more you go from that kind of simplistic project world to the larger scale program world, and it becomes less about creating A every time, and far more about working out what do my large group of stakeholders consider value. Now, as soon as you start to get into that world of value and subjectivity, it's not good enough to say, you wanted A, I have given you A, hurrah. You need to start managing your stakeholder. So you start to think about any kind of really big project, a dam or a massive new IT system. That may succeed in terms of, well, you kind of asked for that, I kind of gave you that. If your C-suite and your stakeholders and the like don't perceive it as successful, you've already lost the game. And we talk about thinking in lines, which is a very structured way of thinking, and thinking in wheels, which is when you get to a more unpredictable area where there are fuzzy boundaries over what good looks like, where stakeholder perception is incredibly important, it's highly complex and it's independent. You start to have to think in a way which is far more about what people think of value, it's far more creativity driven. It's a vast oversimplification, but you can argue that kind of small-scale project management is down this end, where I need to follow process and methodology. And large-scale program and portfolio management becomes far more about people engagement and making sure the C-suite are happy and actually understanding the journey you're taking people on with you. Now that takes you to a really important place, because it basically implies that in this world, there is a right solution. I'm going to do Prince2, or I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'll do that time and time again. In this world, there are only optimal solutions. What I mean by that is the right answer is entirely dependent on what your stakeholders want to do and the culture of your organization. Portfolio management is all about ensuring your change delivers the strategy. Every organization has a different strategy. So what I'm trying to get at is I've worked in a whole range of organizations that do portfolio management. No two of them do the same thing. They all do slightly different things. Some focus on assurance, some focus on dependency, some really just all they do want to do is optimize the portfolio office. So actually, to be good at portfolio management, it's really important to understand what are the range of tools one can apply to do this thing called portfolio management. And then throw it all out the window and walk into that organization and its strategy and its culture afresh and work out which are the tools you need to apply. In other words, it's entirely contextual. So what I wanted to try and do here was give you a bit of a sense of that contextuality and a bit of a sense of the different tools and techniques one can apply in the world of portfolio management. I'm going to pause there. I meant that wasn't a thing. So that's basically, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to what portfolio management is and its structure before we start talking about the book. So I'm going to pause there and see, are there any questions? Does anyone want to dig into anything particular before I jump into the next bit? Yes, please.
If I want to take like these screenshots.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think you're going to release the old...
Yes. Yes. So Adam's kindly shared the slides, so they'll be sent out after the event, and we are recording it, so you'll even get the video link.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
I quite like the thinking in lines and thinking in wheels analogy, if it is an analogy at all. Do you think that that's kind of changed over time, and that perhaps back in the day when project management first came to the fore, it was predominantly thinking in lines, and then actually more and more these days, it's a lot more thinking in wheels, and that's perhaps where the sort of advent of agile and the iterative and the kind of that's came from as well.
Absolutely spot on. I mean, if I talk about my own kind of personal journey in sort of the world of change, my background was psychology, actually. So I did psychology as my initial degrees. I then went into the civil service. And for anyone who's worked around government, you know that there are no absolutes. It is all nuances and shades of grey and stakeholders having secret conversations. So you get very used to working in an environment where what matters to each individual is entirely different, and they aren't really sharing it. You have to be very good at kind of trying to work out that pattern. And I then moved from that into the world of change and Prince2 and all that kind of stuff. And the dichotomy between this kind of concept that to try and deliver kind of value in government, it was all about really understanding what people wanted, to a world where actually I've been given a document that says this is the requirement and you're now going to give that, even though you don't really think that's what's going to make people happy, was massive. Now, if you kind of move over 15 years, and as I came across some program management, I started talking about value and stakeholder and the like, you start to see how, in my opinion, some of our approaches to project management, particularly in waterfall, entirely missed the point of what good change is about. There's a book by, what's his name? I think it's John Seedon. John Seedon is a chap who owns a company called Vanguard, and Vanguard was at the forefront of systems thinking. And I don't know if you've come across systems thinking, but systems thinking is a way of looking at an organization and working out how the different pressures in that organization change the way it works. And John is a very forthright chap, did a lot of stuff in government about 15 years ago, and he writes a lot of books, and they are... Gosh, I've got to be careful what I say here. They're quite involved books. You do have to work your way through it. But John makes a really powerful message in his books when you kind of unpick it. And the message is, I don't really care if it's waterfall. I don't really care if it's agile. The basic problem of change is one of knowledge. And it's the assumption that we know what change to deliver. And I do think sometimes we as kind of change professionals kind of slightly ignore that problem, because in some ways it's quite nice to be told, build me box A. Lovely, I'm going to go away and build me box A. Whereas the real value is knowing that box A is the thing that's going to drive up value. And in the waterfall world, we kind of sit with the board and they tell us to build A. In the agile world, we sit with the business owner or the product owner, and the product owner says, you're going to build me A, and I'm going to look at it every day. But both those people could be entirely wrong, and actually what John tries to point out really importantly in his book is kind of ignore that. What you need to be doing is talking to the customer, really understanding what that customer works, because otherwise you're going to waste your time entirely. So sort of to put it back to your point, I think there's an incredibly important point about us in the change space, about making sure that we aren't just working in lines and building A. We are really thinking about the value we are delivering, what it means to the people we're giving it to, and if we aren't happy with what we're building, we're challenging that. Because actually there's nothing worse than building an A when what they want is a B, if I can use that analogy. The other thing I might say, sorry, I'm just talking about this a lot, but it's a subject I really enjoy. But the other thing I think that's really important about change is, actually for me, the hard thing isn't necessarily building A. The really hard thing, I think, is getting people to make the decisions that says A is the thing we want to build. And we do a lot of work. I mean, my background's really around program management office and portfolio offices. And if you go back again 5 years, that was all about how can I very efficiently get a risk log and stick it in front of some people. What it's about nowadays, though, is there's all this information. How do I package that that's going to help people make decisions? Because ultimately, I think the job of change is about helping people to make decisions efficiently and effectively that allow us to keep moving forward. If you look at something like Universal Credit or something like that, where they stalled, nobody could make decisions over what the right answer is because they couldn't get to the right place. They didn't have the information, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the boldness to do it. I think that's a really important part about how do you get better at making decisions. And that, for me, is when you're sitting in this kind of wheel space. You need to understand how the people work and where they're going to. Sorry, that's a massive diversion, but I shall stop talking about that now. Any more questions before we chunk into the next bit?
All of this hangs off the clarity of the initial vision.
Yeah.
Who gets involved with that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, going back to what I was just saying then, this is entirely worthless if the vision is worthless. And there's two fundamental challenges around that vision. The first is having a vision that is valid, i.e. coming up with a vision that is actually going to move the organisation forward and help it deliver more money or deliver more value to the voters or whatever the hell it is. Now that is primarily the C-suite. You know, you can't get away from the fact that ultimately the CEO's job, usually a director of strategy's job, is to say, this is where the organisation needs to go for us to be successful over the next 5, 10 years. And obviously they're going to consult around to a range of people, but you know what, front and centre, that's kind of the job you come in to do if you sit in those roles. Where I think it gets more interesting for kind of the people who aren't the CEO is how do you take that vision and articulate it in a fashion that allows change to work. What I mean by that is how do you turn it into KPIs or something that I can then go away and say, I'm either going to build you A because you've told me the strategy is A, or I'm going to build A because you've given me a really clear KPI and I'm the owner that says A is the thing that will deliver that. And there's reams of stuff written about that. And again, depending on what's your particular methodology, you've got various different people who do it. My absolute golden rule around this is, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't track against it, but it doesn't always have to come down to money. So I'm quite happy with lead indicators that will tell me I'm on the journey to that, but never have too many because actually you get into a really awkward position where people are balancing these different measures off each other. Probably the most interesting movement we've had in this space in the last few years is something called OKRs, which is something that came out of Google, I think it was. I may have just made that up, but I think it was Google, one of those guys. OKR stands for Objective and Key Results. The idea is, outcome and key results, sorry. Someone will Google it and tell me if it's objectives or outcomes. The idea is, though, you have a nice big vision, and there's only 4 or 5 of them, nice big vision, which is kind of the objective of the outcome, and that's essentially what your C-suite bods give you. Boom, boom, boom. Now, the key result is not trying to say, give me £50,000 or give me £100,000 or whatever. It's basically trying to say, there's a journey we're going to go on, and you can move the dial from 0 to 1 based on how close you get to that journey. Now, the real value of that is it allows you to talk about something that's quite that's quite secret to the organisation in a way that can be very public. So we can be really clear about what our objectives are. We can have our dials of 0 to 1, and everybody knows that these pieces of work are feeding into that one, and this one's ideally going to move the dial by 5% or 10% or 20%. So you're able to have a conversation about achieving the objectives. Everyone knows what they're pushing towards. And you can talk about moving the dial in a very public fashion. It allows you to have quite an open discussion. So that's a really interesting way of trying to talk about strategy in a way that everyone can buy into. And actually, if you're in that space, it's definitely worth having a look at. Anything else I can throw in at this point?
Just, Adam, it was objectives and key results.
Objectives and key results. Thank you. Thank you. Outcomes and key results. Hey, I could make that up. That's my one. Outcomes and key results. Yeah. Sorry.
I think it's important where you, or who's drawing the system boundaries within which you're managing your portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if you jump back to SAFE, they came up with a lovely term. They call it guardrails. So they say, we don't want to stop you doing the right thing because you at the ground level know what the right thing is, but we do need to give you boundaries or guardrails. So we'll say the guardrails are you can't spend over this amount of money, or you can't release in this period of time because actually we know this is going now. And I think that's a really good point. And again, the really interesting, if you pull from the world of agile project management, you have this concept of the delivery team and then the architects. And the architects are essentially the ones who talk about the boundaries you can work within and you can't go outside of. And the delivery teams are the people who kind of do the delivery, as I'm sure you know. And I think there's a really interesting concept in the portfolio space, which is give me the boundaries I can work within and then let me get on with it. But be really clear about those boundaries, So I think you're absolutely right. There's a really important boundary conversation that needs to happen. Cool. All right. I shall crack on. So, why am I here? Well, mainly to sell my book. I don't get any money from this, by the way. We did it for the love of it, didn't we? Okay, so portfolio management, a practical guide. So if you're really interested in portfolio management, we kind of pulled this together. And it does, in my opinion, a few things that are slightly different to what's already available out there in terms of portfolio management approaches. Because what we've tried to do is be quite honest about that statement I made, that there are as many portfolio functions as there are organisations, because they are entirely contextual, they are bound by the organisation, they are bound by the strategy. And on our committee, as you'll see later, there's people who work in Royal Mail, National Grid, in government, in utility, in all these different sectors, and we all do slightly different stuff. So there's no way we're going to sit down and say, this is the one perfect way of doing this. What we did want to do, though, was talk about the craft of portfolio management. Talk about the things you can do. And I talked a bit earlier about saying, well, you can do optimization or you can do assurance, and there are these different kind of things you can do under it. We wanted to talk about that kind of menu of stuff you could try and do if you're doing portfolio management, and give some examples and top tips of how that could be realized and what we've seen in the real world. We wanted to do that through some really practical examples. And we wanted to talk a lot about actually how you create a burning bridge that gets people excited about portfolio management. So if you can recall at the beginning, I was saying the real big problem is psychology. This only works if the senior stakeholders are excited. And as anyone who's worked around the C-suite knows, they have the attention span of, well, a 2-year-old kid mainly. So actually what tends to happen is you get called in to build a portfolio office, the CFO or someone's incredibly excited about it, you get lots of attention, you get up the first one, you go for the first couple of boards, and then something else pretty runs past them and you kind of lose them and they don't attend the next one, and then you start to lose cohesion. So creating that sense of burning platform, creating that energy and that excitement that ensures that the C-suites keep turning up is incredibly important. And we talk a lot about that in that, so how you actually role play, how you actually sort of deliver that. So, broken down into 4 sections. I say the what, the why, and how it benefits you. So actually, why would you want to do this? How do you do it? Adopting portfolio management, how it links to the existing organisation and aligns to the drivers. What it looks like. So what are those core processes that you might adopt? What have we used successfully in various organisations? Have you worked in? Where does it work? Where doesn't it work? And then we talk a little bit about that kind of implementation, because actually that's where it almost always goes wrong when you're trying to do it, because actually you lose people's attention and you can't keep them engaged. So, as I say, we talk about the introduction, we talk quite a bit about portfolio management contributions to business success. So where is it helpful? What does it help you do? You know, to ensure early identification of projects and programs, ensure visibility of those programs and their interdependencies, and so on and so forth. And probably more interestingly, I talk about the problems it solves. So what will you see going wrong in your organization that means actually portfolio management is probably the solution? Because actually 9 times out of 10, when I talk to people, it's less about, hey, you really want portfolio management. It's far more about, you're seeing some problems in your organization, aren't you? Your problems are, actually, you can't work out the scopes. The scope of the programs keeps running, or you can't coordinate your business strategy, or you're having resource challenges. Have you thought about portfolio management? It can be really very helpful. So in the introduction, we'll talk about both the successes and the problems it solves. We then deeper down into, well, what's the overarching structure that we, the APM, use to talk through portfolio management? And you'll probably be familiar with this because I've droned on about it for a good 45 minutes now. But the real importance of vision as a corporate strategy, aligning to a strategic plan, construct and prioritize the portfolio, continually review, check you've delivered what you've delivered. Reporting, supporting that journey. And then down here, this assurance thing, develop, monitor, and control the portfolios to go through. And ultimately, it's all about delivering those benefits, achieving those goals, which then flips back to the strategic plan that you reassess on a genuine basis. In the book, we dig into those different steps and actually how that might work. I don't know why that just did that. Must have been something I was trying to do. That seemed very clever at the time. We then talk about actually the adoption of it, and we dip into the various different aspects, so the strategic plan, governance, how you get people engaged and aligned. Risk is a very big part. Actually, if you just say jump back 10 years, you wouldn't have talked about risk at the portfolio level. Nowadays, it's all you talk about, because actually what you're trying to do when you optimize is not just balance cost against value, but you're trying to pull in the aspect of deliverability. So there's no point it being the cheapest thing that's going to deliver the world's greatest benefit if you've only got a 5% chance of delivering it. So it's really important to be able to balance those three acts. And that's actually incredibly hard, believe it or not. The risk stuff is actually the really hard bit about portfolio management, because you're making an assessment about deliverability, which is sort of the million-dollar question of project and program management. How do I increase the ability to deliver this change? So that's kind of a really hard part of it. Benefits management, actually the return of investment. And then we dig into a little bit around the different delivery methodologies, which is essentially code for waterfall versus agile. So we talk a lot about actually measuring apples and pears and that like. Oh, what's that doing there? How would you describe the approach to portfolio management within your organization? Oh yes, this is just a survey we did where people were basically saying they were trying to do it and were doing it particularly badly, which is not uncommon. Oh yes, an agile versus waterfall, yeah. These were our top 4 tips. It's interesting, actually, I wrote this particular bit. It takes an absolute age to publish anything through professional bodies. I don't know how you guys find it in the BCS, but it takes an awfully long time. And I actually remember writing this chapter good 2 years ago in a little coffee shop just behind our offices. And I read it now, and I slightly cringe, because actually my kind of agile journey's taken me on a very different place. There is some good stuff in there, but actually, if I'd known a lot about SAFE, I think I'd have pulled that in a bit more detail. But really, we talk about actually managing the level of uncertainty and supporting iteration, value in the role of the business stakeholder, and focusing on the risk of delivery. So what we're essentially saying there is, actually, if you want to, you can try and iterate above the agile and waterfall level, so you can treat them all as the same thing and manage to drop down value streams. And actually, that doesn't really stop you managing to deliver in an iterative fashion. But the really fundamental thing is about who gets to define value. Because, of course, in a waterfall world, it's usually the SRO. In your agile world, value is defined by the business owner, who's pretty close down to the business. And actually, how do you manage that in the governance structure you're trying to work within? We then jump into these various core processes. I shan't go into that in too much detail because there's quite a lot in the book, but it's basically saying how do you do the individual things, so the construction and prioritization of the portfolio, the monitoring, individually supporting programs and projects, because actually there is quite a large role in the portfolio office for setting up the standards for program delivery. So what you might think of as the center of excellence role, a lot of portfolio offices co-opt that. So that's their job to make sure projects and programs are delivered correctly. And of course, you've got the reviewing, And of course, you'll never get away from the machinery that is the reporting on the portfolio, sucking that information up and turning it into something that you can make decisions on. It's incredibly important. And there's a whole load of different examples of governance structures and reports and risk logs and the like that we've used in various different companies we've worked in over the years. And then we finally get to a point around how does one implement it? So sort of top trips for implementation. So I talk about how do you create burning business and a sense of need. For me, again, attention is about early successes. So and actually this applies to any kind of office, I stage manage the rollout of an office quite carefully, because what I want to make sure happens that at each of the major governance events, something new is appearing on a dashboard, or there's something new to discuss. So, the first time they come, we talk about dependency stuff, and then the next time the dependency's there, but we're talking about the roadmap journey and stuff. So I'm a big fan of stage managing that journey in its entirety. So we talk quite a lot about that, getting sponsorship and meeting the needs of the sponsors, and actually, time spent talking to people at the C-suite about what they really want to see is never wasted time, because if you can turn back up in the room with that, you're onto a winner. And actually, how do you manage to align your linear change governance with the cyclical organizational governance? Because that's where things are going to go wrong. We have a little final debate about something that's quite topical at the moment, which is what we call centralized versus decentralized. Centralized basically says I'm going to keep all my change activity in one central space and have a whole division that manages it. Decentralized says, no, each individual division will do its own change and we'll just kind of control the journey from the top and report from the top. I say I've been in the change world for about 15 years, and it's interesting because you tend to go through cycles of people being really pushing the centralized thing. We just want one single place where change is done in the organization. And then saying, no, that's all wrong. We're going back to decentralized. And sort of 3-4 years later, it goes back to centralized. The trick is not whether it's centralized or decentralized. I think the trick is how do you manage the world based on whether it's centralized or decentralized. And we talk a little bit about how you might want to manage that as you go through the implementation. We talk a lot about actually the challenges and actually how one overcomes them. For me, the absolute number one problem you are always going to find is lack of clarity over the organization's vision's goal. I find it fascinating when you start to talk to people at the C-suite and you get them into individual conversations and you talk to them about what they think the strategy is and just how different the story you get each time. They all have various different angles on the strategy, unless it's a very coordinated C-suite. That's always fascinating. And probably the worst thing you do is walk into an organization that has a 50-page strategy document, because you just know they're going to pick the bits from that they actually want. I'm much, much keener on a very tight strategy. For very portfolio management, as I say, if you haven't got that, you aren't really past square one. It's a really interesting conversation to see where people think the strategy of the organization is going. But that's one of them. There are a range of others we dip into in the book. And we talk about top tips, and I've picked out my 3 favorite top tips for trying to implement portfolio management. So, demonstrate the value of portfolio management by, for example, showing improvements in strategic alignment and overall ROI. I'm a massive fan of when you bring in any kind of office, whether it's program or portfolio office, you treat yourself like a project. You have a duty to show value back to the business. The real trick is to agree with the business before you do it, what that value is going to be, so you can present it back. Massive fan of, when you start to do this, know where the value is, know what your customer wants, and make sure they are aware that you have given it to them at every single stage. Be seen to be consistent and fair across the portfolio, irrespective of an individual program or project sponsor's influence. This is by far the hardest part of an established portfolio, and we often say the portfolio office is not a true portfolio office until it has killed a project or a program. And I'm sure I've worked in places where there are essentially zombie offices that effectively what they do is report, but they don't really have any control over the levers. And it's a little bit sneaky, but actually when we set up a portfolio, you almost always have to find what's that project you're going to kill early that's not delivering value, so you can prove that you can do it, and that this environment, this thing you have constructed, has teeth. So it's really important to be able to do that, otherwise you are never going to be able to have a proper conversation about the value that the change portfolio is delivering. And you can only do that if you are seen to be free and fair amongst all the program and project sponsors, so you're not playing favourites. That is considerably easier said than it is done. I'm not underestimating that by anything, but actually it's pretty pointless unless you're able to do it. And prioritise strategic goals clearly and build into unambiguous portfolio rules. So coming back to that point of actually how do you link to the strategy? There's absolutely no point doing it unless you can clearly show the strategic value you're trying to deliver and can link it back to, and can link it back to that. Sean, what's your top favourite portfolio? Do you have a particular one you like to use?
So I think I'd just build on your point about building in rules. So I think you can't be consistent and fair across the portfolio in terms of prioritisation unless you can clearly demonstrate how each initiative in the portfolio links to the strategy. So as part of the rules that you build in, you should be able to quantify how much each initiative contributes to the portfolio.
It's the golden rule. Really, really important stuff. Really important stuff. But of course, there are plenty more in this book if you buy it. So that is kind of it around the book. As I say, we try and be very practical, lots of examples of how it works, and we are very specific about talking you through the journey, which is actually how do you implement it, creating the burning bridge, and what it might look like as you go on the way. And this is some of the people who wrote it. And as I say, we're all kind of protagonists. There's me, many, many years ago, looking kind of young and fresh-faced. Richard's National Grid. Steve works for Tata, so he's done a lot of big pharma portfolio management. Lynn, Yorkshire Building Society, runs their portfolio office. Steve was a consultant, but did a lot of stuff with Lloyds and Barclays. Mike works in the pharma world. So quite a spread of people, quite a spread of sectors, which is why we feel quite confident sitting and saying, actually, there's no right answer here. There's just a lot of ways to get it wrong and one or two ways to get it kind of right, and you really need to know the tools to make it work. And if you click on that, it will take you to a place where you can buy it. So there you go, really. Now, we've got a very small 5 minutes left, which Ocean's going to do, which is just going to sort of talk a bit about the APM. But before we jump into that, let me just say, any questions on the book or any further thoughts that you've got around portfolio management before we move on? Yes, sir.
I was just thinking about...
Can you speak up?
I was wondering why the government isn't talking more about portfolios of infrastructure spend.
So,
like HS2 would be
I said
project to be...
So to be fair to the government, so the government promoted and was actually one of the real early adopters of portfolio management. So there's a bit of the government that was called the MPA, the Major Projects Area, is now called the IPA, the Infrastructure and Project Authority. Authority Association? God, sorry. I've actually worked in it, so I should know what the bloody acronym means. But to be fair to that, I talk about that as the government's portfolio office, and it has two fundamental roles. One is to be able to report on the portfolio and say, this is the journey we're on. And the other side is the kind of centre of excellence thing, so saying, what does good project programme management look like? So actually, you can actually go to their publications, and it talks about the kind of, they talk about the 45 mega projects that they run. And they've done a huge amount, they fund an awful lot of research into change management. So the Masters I went on was funded essentially by, they set up the concept with Oxford, so that's where a lot of government change professionals go through. And in fact, management of portfolios and MSP and all those different kind of concepts were essentially funded through OGC and government. So actually a lot of that is down to government's pushing. Where they really struggle though, again, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here, as an organisation, they are now a mash of two separate, so a bit that used to worry about transformation and a bit that used to worry about infrastructure. They've pushed those two bits together, and that's kind of slightly working out which one's preeminent and which is roles and standards they're going to kind of promote. And the other thing that's interesting about them is they kind of move between priorities. So are we about reporting on the portfolio? Are we about promoting good projects and programme management? They do tend to sway between those different positions, and based on where the priority is, that's what tends to come out of that bit of government. So, I'm a massive fan. I mean, I'm a civil servant, obviously. I'm a massive fan of what they do, and I do think they do some incredibly good stuff. And they also work in an incredibly hard environment. So there was nobody stupid on Universal Credit. These aren't stupid people. The challenge, though, is just so vast in such a confused environment that it's incredibly hard to make progress. So the people working really hard to do really good stuff. But as I say, some of it's really good, some of it lacks a bit of focus. Sorry.
Question specific to the universal credit piece.
Sorry. Question specific to the universal credit piece. If it was so complicated, and it has proved to be chaos. I say chaos, you say challenging. Why wasn't it killed off?
Oh, gosh.
And is that the lack of, I don't know, maybe Ian Duncan Smith's ego or somebody else's? I'm not asking you to quote on Ian Duncan Smith, but it just, I mean, HS2, Crossrail, they've got problems, but maybe they're problems that can be solved. Universal credit, it just seems like...
Well, UC actually came from a really sensible concept.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, basically the concept behind UC, or universal credit, was there are a whole load of different benefits that get paid. If you are, for instance, an unemployed mother of two, there is no point going back into work, because the second you earn over 16 hours a week on minimum wage, you lose all your benefits. So actually, by getting a job, you actually lose money. So, and what Ian Duncan Smith did, and love him or hate it, what he basically did when he went out of power was go out and look at all these places and actually do some really ask some really difficult questions, and do some maths that nobody in government had really done. And the maths basically said, these people aren't lazy, they're just not stupid. And actually, if you are a unemployed mother of three, probably the most sensible job you do is do something which is part-time and with minimum wage. And if you go to a part-time or minimum wage, you are going to lose money. So by going into work, you are fundamentally going to, it's that simple. So what universal credit tries to do is say, well, let's pull all those benefits together so we can see the impact of those, and then make sure that nobody loses money by going into work. Now, I'm pretty sure nobody in this room can disagree. That's a really good idea. Where it started to fall down, though, was then by trying to take all those different benefits and trying to pull them all into one place, again, into one system, and work out how they're going to engage with the population and ask them what they're on and all that kind of stuff. All those different metrics that you get whenever you start to dig into a government problem, all of them started to crush the system. And you had these massive boulder of concepts, which is, so how are we going to find out what people are on? How are we going to pull together these different benefit systems from different areas? And as you start to lose benefits from the process, as you go from, say, all 10 benefits down to 4, it starts to become less effective, because the other benefits you can't pull in because it's too complicated then start to skew the system in ways you don't want to know. So that's a really it's a very simplified reason that says, you know what, a really simple idea.
There's the unethical parts of it as well. They're making people wait 8 weeks for money, which is no justification whatsoever, other than making them suffer for being poor.
But to be fair, that wasn't part of the original thing. So where that came through,
part of it now.
It absolutely is. But that comes down to a problem of realisation, which says we think the easiest way to do it is to take an approach that HMRC takes for tax. Okay, but actually, if you try to treat unimpaired people who have potentially chaotic lives as if they are self-employed, you get a very different relationship with them. So I'm not, please don't think I'm sitting here defending that. I am just trying to point out that what started as an incredibly sensible process suddenly starts to crumble. And from the point of view of this conversation, the agile journey, agile just couldn't even get off the ground because it couldn't define what the business need was. Yeah. So that's where it just kind of fell down as it's still running.
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually think that the issue is that the government seems to have no idea about implementation scale. I mean, I've seen it in other government departments as well. They've got this great idea of what they want to implement and say everyone's going to have one of these. And then they misunderstand the difficulty of the technology sometimes and don't understand. The scale is just enormous. It's nothing like any industry project ever.
Yep.
The scale they do not understand, and they always get it wrong.
I mean, these aren't stupid people. I mean, these are my friends. These are people I kind of came up with. So that I freely say they're not stupid people. The scale is fundamentally different. And I think one of the big problems is they look at examples in industry and consulting firms and people like me and other people who come in and say it's going to be fine. We've done it over here. And actually, it's not fine, and it's fundamentally different as a problem. And of course, one of the major problems is actually if you look at the government stack of kind of computers, the systems, it's this incredibly complicated legacy structure form, and you come at it as if it's a greenfield site. It's not. It's just a sort of, it's an incredible mess of stuff that's been going around for decades. So it's really hard to make any kind of a headway. Having said that, there are some really notable exceptions of that, some really impressive stuff, but it's a hell of a place to try and make change happen. It's hard work, hard work. Oh, that went quite intense, didn't it?